Some promises eat at a man's soul for 40 years, growing heavier with each sunrise until they become too much to carry alone. There ain't enough money in the world to buy peace when you've left a friend behind in a war that nobody talks about anymore. Colt Maddox learned this the hard way when he traded his $200 million empire for a pickup truck and a set of coordinates written on faded paper. At 68 years old, he drove into the Mojave Desert to find a rusted helicopter that had been waiting for him since Vietnam. The lawyers called him crazy. His family called him foolish. But sometimes a man has to lose everything to find what really matters. Inside that twisted metal wreckage lay a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, sacrifice, and the true cost of coming home. What was worth giving up a fortune to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light crept across the sprawling Maddox ranch like a slow confession, illuminating 20,000 acres of Texas hill country that Colt had built from sweat, blood, and an eye for opportunity that most men only dreamed of possessing. The main house stood like a monument to success, 12,000 square feet of limestone and cedar, with wraparound porches that could host a small town's worth of guests. But success had a way of echoing in empty rooms, and Colt had been listening to that hollow sound for the better part of 3 years now. He sat on the front porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, staring at the oil drilling contract that had started it all back in 1985. The document was yellowed with age, signed in his younger, more confident handwriting, back when he believed that striking oil meant striking happiness. That first well had changed everything. Within 5 years, he'd gone from being a hired ranch hand to owning more property than some small counties. Within 10 years, he was buying up drilling rights across 3 states. By his 50th birthday, magazines were calling him the Cowboy King of Black Gold. But gold, black or otherwise, couldn't warm an empty bed or fill the silence where laughter used to live. Margaret had passed 3 years ago come September, cancer that ate through her like acid, taking the light out of their home one painful day at a time. She'd been the heart of this place, the reason all that success meant something. Without her, the ranch felt like a museum, every room holding memories that hurt more than they healed. Their daughter, Sarah, lived in Dallas now, married to a banker who wore suits that cost more than most folks made in a month. She visited twice a year, Christmas and Colt's birthday, bringing her 2 boys who were more interested in their phones than horses. The boys were good kids, but they looked at Colt like he was some relic from a bygone era, a grandfather who smelled of leather and spoke in metaphors they didn't understand. Sarah had been after him for months to sell the ranch, move to some retirement community where he could play golf and complain about the weather with other old-timers. She meant well, but she didn't understand that a man couldn't just pack up his life's work like it was winter clothes going into storage. What she really didn't understand was the weight that had been pressing down on Colt's chest since long before her mother died, a weight that had nothing to do with oil wells or cattle prices and everything to do with a promise he'd made to a friend in a jungle 47 years ago. Tommy Reeves had been his co-pilot in Vietnam, a kid from small-town Oklahoma with a grin that could charm the bark off a tree and reflexes that had saved their helicopter crew more times than Colt could count. They'd flown together for 8 months, covering supply runs and troop transport across territory that changed hands more often than a poker chip. Tommy had a way of making even the worst missions feel manageable, always cracking jokes over the radio, always finding something good to say about the worst situations. The last time Colt saw him alive was on a Tuesday in March 1976. They'd been grounded for maintenance, sitting in the mess tent, playing cards, and talking about what they'd do when they got back to the States. Tommy had shown him a picture of a girl named Linda from back home. Blonde hair, sweet smile, the kind of girl who made a young man believe in forever. He was going to marry her, he said. going to buy a little farm and raise horses and kids and live the kind of life that made the war seem like a bad dream. That night, Tommy had drawn a rough map on a napkin showing Colt some coordinates in the California desert. "If something happens to me," he'd said, suddenly serious, "and you make it back, I need you to go there. There's something I buried out there." Colt had laughed it off, told Tommy nothing was going to happen, that they'd both be home drinking beer and chasing girls before the year was out. But Tommy had grabbed his wrist, looked him straight in the eye and said, "Promise me, Colt. Swear on your mother's grave you'll go if I don't make it back." So he'd promised. What else could he do? 3 days later, Tommy's helicopter went down in a valley 30 miles from base camp. Search and rescue found wreckage but no bodies. The official report said hostile fire brought them down, but the guys who flew the search mission said it didn't look right. The crash pattern was all wrong, like the bird had been forced down rather than shot down. Tommy Reeves was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. His body was never recovered. His family was told he died serving his country, and that had to be enough. But it wasn't enough for Colt. For 47 years, he'd carried that napkin with Tommy's coordinates in his wallet, moving it from one worn leather billfold to the next. He'd told himself 100 times that he'd go out there someday, when he had time, when the business wasn't so demanding, when the moment felt right. The moment never felt right. There was always another well to drill, another deal to close, another crisis that needed his attention. Margaret understood about the war. She'd held him through enough nightmares to know that some scars went deeper than skin, but even she didn't know about Tommy's final request. Now, sitting on his porch with an oil contract that had made him rich but couldn't make him whole, Colt finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. He hadn't built this empire for himself. He'd built it to avoid dealing with the promise he'd made to a dead friend. Every well, every ranch, every successful venture had been another way to stay busy enough to ignore the growing weight in his chest. But Margaret's death had changed something fundamental in him. Without her to share his success, without her laughter to fill the empty spaces, the money felt meaningless. The accolades felt hollow. The respect of other businessmen felt like smoke, impressive from a distance, but offering no real substance when you got close enough to touch it. He'd started having dreams about Tommy again, not nightmares exactly, but strange, sad dreams where his old friend would appear in the cockpit of their helicopter, shaking his head with disappointment. In the dreams, Tommy never spoke, just looked at him with those knowing eyes and pointed toward the horizon, toward something Colt couldn't quite see. Sarah thought he was going through a delayed grief reaction, maybe some kind of depression that would pass with time and proper medical attention. She'd suggested therapists, medications, even a cruise to help him find himself again. What she couldn't understand was that he'd already found himself. He was a man who'd spent 47 years avoiding a promise, and now time was running out to make things right. The oil drilling contract crinkled in his hands as he folded it carefully and placed it back in the manila folder with all the other documents that proved how successful Colt Maddox had become. Success measured in dollars and acres, in newspaper articles and business awards, in everything except the one currency that actually mattered, a man's word to his friend. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting the morning chill and too many years of hard living. The coffee had gone completely cold, but he drank it anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. It seemed appropriate somehow. Nothing in his life tasted quite right anymore. Inside the house, the silence pressed against him like a living thing. Margaret's pictures still smiled from the mantel, and her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table where she'd left them the last time she'd been strong enough to read. He'd kept everything exactly as she'd left it, not out of sentiment, but out of a strange kind of paralysis, as if changing anything would mean admitting she was really gone. But she was gone, and keeping her world frozen in time wouldn't bring her back any more than money could buy forgiveness for promises unkept. Colt walked to his study and pulled out the bottom drawer of his oak desk, the drawer that contained everything he'd never been able to throw away. Tommy's napkin was there, faded but still readable. So were Tommy's dog tags, which had been returned to Colt after the army gave up searching for his friend's body. A photograph of their crew, 8 young men grinning in front of their helicopter, was tucked behind a stack of old letters. He held the photograph up to the morning light, streaming through the window. Tommy was third from the left, arm draped around Colt's shoulders, both of them so young they looked like boys playing dress-up in military uniforms. Tommy's grin was infectious, even in the faded photo, the kind of smile that made you want to smile back, even when you didn't feel like it. "I'm sorry I waited so long," Colt said quietly to the photograph. "But I'm ready now. I'm finally ready to keep my word." He placed the photo, the napkin, and the dog tags in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Then he picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer's number. It was time to do something that would shock everyone who thought they knew Colt Maddox. It was time to trade an empire for the chance at redemption. The conference room at Hartwell, Brennan and Associates had seen its share of dramatic moments over the years, but nothing quite like the scene unfolding on this particular Tuesday morning in October. 3 of Dallas's most expensive lawyers sat around a mahogany table that cost more than most people's cars, staring at documents that would make headlines from Texas to Wall Street. Colt Maddox sat at the head of the table, dressed in his good jeans and the white shirt Margaret had always said brought out the blue in his eyes. He'd polished his boots that morning, though he couldn't say exactly why. Maybe a man ought to look his best when he's about to shock the hell out of everyone who thinks they know him. "Mr. Maddox," said William Hartwell, senior partner and family friend for the past 15 years, "I need you to understand what you're asking me to do here. This isn't just selling a few properties or liquidating some investments. You're talking about dismantling an empire that took you 40 years to build." The legal documents spread across the table told the story in cold, precise language. Transfer of ownership for the Maddox Ranch, all 20,000 acres. Sale of drilling rights across 3 states, liquidation of oil company stock, dissolution of the Maddox Energy Corporation. When it was all said and done, Colt would walk away with roughly $10 million, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life, but a fraction of what he'd built. The rest, $190 million, would go to various charities, with the largest portion establishing a foundation for veterans' families. Margaret would have liked that, he thought. She'd always said that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he accumulated, but by what he left behind. "I understand perfectly well what I'm asking," Colt replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "I want it all liquidated within 30 days. The paperwork's all there, who gets what, where the money goes, how it's to be handled." James Brennan, the younger partner who'd handled most of Colt's business transactions, leaned forward with the intensity of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. "Sir, with respect, this seems extraordinarily sudden. Have you considered the tax implications, the market conditions? We could structure this over several years. Minimize your losses. It's not about the money, son." "Then what is it about?" The third lawyer, Patricia Coleman, had been brought in specifically because of her expertise in mental competency issues. Colt could see the wheels turning behind her professional smile. She was already calculating how to argue that grief had made him temporarily insane. Before Colt could answer, the conference room door burst open with enough force to rattle the diplomas on the wall. Sarah Maddox Harrison swept in like a Texas thunderstorm, her heels clicking on the marble floor with the staccato rhythm of barely controlled fury. "Daddy, what the hell do you think you're doing?" She was 38 years old and had inherited her mother's beauty, along with her father's stubborn streak, a combination that had served her well in her own business ventures but made family negotiations feel like armed combat. Today, she wore a navy business suit that probably cost more than most people made in a week, and her blonde hair was pulled back in the kind of severe bun that meant serious business. "Good morning, sweetheart," Colt said mildly. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Don't you?" "Good morning, sweetheart. Me," Sarah snapped, placing her hands flat on the table and leaning toward him like a prosecutor confronting a hostile witness. "Bill called me an hour ago, said you'd lost your mind and were trying to give away everything you've worked for. Please tell me he's exaggerating." Colt gestured toward the documents. "See for yourself." Sarah grabbed the nearest contract and scanned it quickly, her face growing paler with each line. "The ranch? Daddy, you're selling the ranch?" "The place where Mama lived, where I grew up, where your grandchildren come to visit. The new owners will take good care of it. I made sure of that in the contract." "That's not the point." Her voice cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath the anger. "That's our home. That's our family's legacy. You can't just throw it away like it means nothing." "It doesn't mean nothing," Colt said quietly, "but it's not where I need to be anymore." "Then where do you need to be?" Sarah's voice had dropped to a whisper, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to climb onto his lap after nightmares, seeking comfort in his steady presence. Colt reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the faded photograph of his helicopter crew, placing it gently on the table where everyone could see it. 8 young faces grinned back at them from across nearly 5 decades, frozen in a moment of camaraderie that war and time couldn't touch. "I need to be keeping a promise I made to this man," he said, pointing to Tommy Reeves. "A promise I should have kept 47 years ago." Sarah picked up the photograph, studying it with the intensity she'd inherited from her father. "Who is he?" "My co-pilot in Vietnam. My friend. The best man I ever knew, and I let him down in the worst way possible." "Daddy, the war was 50 years ago. Whatever happened over there, whatever you think you should have done." "I don't think, sweetheart. I know exactly what I should have done, and I didn't do it. Now I'm running out of time to make it right." William Hartwell cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should take a step back here, Mr. Maddox. Grief can sometimes make us feel like we need to make dramatic changes to somehow honor the memory of those we've lost." "This isn't about grief," Colt interrupted, though his voice remained calm. "This is about integrity. About keeping your word when it matters, even when it costs you everything." Sarah sank into the chair across from him, still clutching the photograph. "What kind of promise? What could be so important that you'd give up everything we've built?" Colt pulled out the napkin with Tommy's coordinates, unfolding it carefully on the table. The ink had faded, but the numbers were still legible, a set of GPS coordinates that had been waiting in his wallet for nearly half a century. "Before he died, Tommy asked me to go to these coordinates if something happened to him. He said there was something important there, something that mattered. I promised I would, and then I spent the next 47 years making excuses for why I couldn't keep that promise." "So go," Sarah said, frustration bleeding through her voice. "Take a weekend, drive out there, see whatever there is to see. You don't have to destroy everything you've accomplished to keep a promise to a dead man." Colt shook his head slowly. "It doesn't work that way, sweetheart. A man can't approach something this important with divided loyalties. If I'm going to do this, really do this, then I need to do it right. I need to go out there with nothing but the promise itself. No safety net, no empire to fall back on if things get difficult." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd grown up around her father's business dealings, had seen him make decisions that seemed crazy to everyone else, but somehow always worked out. This felt different, though more personal, more final. Patricia Coleman leaned forward with professional concern. "Mr. Maddox, I have to ask, have you been experiencing any depression, any feelings of hopelessness since your wife's passing?" "Sometimes grief can manifest as a desire to make radical changes." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Colt said, meeting her gaze directly. "I've spent 3 years sitting in that empty house, surrounded by everything I thought I wanted, and I've been miserable every single day. The money can't bring Margaret back, and it can't ease the weight I carry about Tommy. But maybe, if I'm lucky, keeping my word to him might give me some peace." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the faded napkin with its careful coordinates. Finally, she looked up at her father with eyes that held both love and exasperation. "You're really going to do this, aren't you? No matter what I say, no matter what anyone says, you're going to sign away everything you've worked for and drive off into the desert chasing ghosts." "I am." She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the kind her mother used to take before accepting one of Colt's more outrageous decisions. Then God help us all. Colt reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I know you don't understand, sweetheart. I know this seems like I'm abandoning everything that matters. But sometimes a man has to lose everything to find out who he really is." An hour later, the contracts were signed, witnessed, and filed. Colt Maddox, who had arrived at the law office as one of the wealthiest men in Texas, walked out with a cashier's check for $10 million and the coordinates to a place he'd been afraid to visit for 47 years. The rest, his life's work, his monument to success, his hedge against ever being powerless again, belonged to other people now. What remained was the man himself, the promise he'd made, and the long road to redemption that stretched ahead like a desert highway with no visible end. 2 days later, Colt loaded his pickup truck with everything he figured he'd need for a journey that might take him anywhere from a week to the rest of his life. The truck was a 2018 Ford F-150, midnight blue, with enough miles on it to prove it was more than just a rich man's toy. He'd bought it new but had never babied it. Margaret used to tease him about driving a $100,000 truck to check on cattle that could have cared less about his choice of transportation. The morning was crisp and clear, with that particular quality of autumn light that made everything seem both sharper and more forgiving. He stood in the driveway of the house that would soon belong to a family from Austin, good people, the lawyers had assured him, who would respect the land and maintain the traditions that made the place special. His packing had been methodical, almost military in its precision. Clothes for 2 weeks, though he suspected this journey might take longer. Camping gear that hadn't seen use since his younger days but was still in good condition. Tools, first aid supplies, and enough food to last a man who wasn't particular about gourmet dining. He'd included Margaret's thermos, the one she'd used for their Sunday drives, filled with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The most important items rode in his shirt pocket: Tommy's faded napkin with the coordinates, the photograph of their helicopter crew, and something he'd discovered that morning while going through his old military gear, Tommy's dog tags, which had been returned to him after the army officially declared his friend missing in action. He'd forgotten about the dog tags until he was packing his own military mementos. They were tarnished with age but still readable. Reeves, Thomas J. 123456789, B15, NOV 54, M.R.C. Below that, stamped in smaller letters, no preference. Tommy had been one of those guys who didn't much care about organized religion but figured he ought to put something down on the forms, just in case. The metal felt warm in Colt's palm as he examined them in the morning light. He'd carried guilt about these dog tags for decades. They'd been returned to him because the army had no next of kin information for Tommy, and somehow Colt had never found the courage to track down Tommy's family and give them this small piece of their lost son. Another failure. Another promise deferred. His phone rang as he was adjusting the load in his truck bed, and Sarah's number appeared on the screen. He'd been expecting this call. She'd been unusually quiet since the signing, which in Sarah's case usually meant she was planning something. "Morning, sweetheart." "Don't you morning sweetheart me," she said, though her tone was more worried than angry. "I've been thinking about this crazy scheme of yours, and I've decided I'm not going to let you drive off into the desert alone to chase ghosts. I appreciate the concern, but I'm coming with you." Colt paused in the middle of securing a tarp over his camping gear. "You most certainly are not. Watch me. I've already called Richard and told him I'll be taking some personal time. The boys are with his parents this week anyway, so there's nothing stopping me from making sure my father doesn't get himself killed in some godforsaken wasteland." Sarah, this isn't a family vacation. This is something I need to do alone. Why? Because it's some kind of macho cowboy thing where you have to prove you're tough enough to handle whatever's out there. Daddy, you're 68 years old. You have no idea what you're going to find at those coordinates, if you even find them at all. What if? What if I finally do something because it's right, instead of because it's safe? Colt interrupted gently. Sweetheart, I know you're worried. I know this seems reckless and maybe even selfish, but some things a man has to face by himself. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. I'm scared, Daddy. I'm scared that you're running away from us, from your real family, to chase after something that happened 50 years ago. I'm scared that you're going to get out there and realize that this whole thing was just grief talking, but it'll be too late to come back. Colt leaned against the truck, feeling the weight of her words. I'm not running away from you, sweetheart. If anything, I'm trying to run toward the man you deserve to have as a father. The man your mother married. The man who keeps his promises, even when it costs him everything. But what if keeping this promise costs you your life? Then at least I'll have kept it. He could hear her crying softly, and it nearly broke his resolve. Sarah had always been his weakness. From the day she was born, he'd been wrapped around her little finger, and she knew it. But this time, he couldn't let her need for security override what he knew he had to do. I tell you what, he said after a moment. I'll call you every evening, check in, and let you know where I am and how I'm doing. If something goes wrong, if I get in over my head, I'll ask for help. Fair enough? Promise? I promise. Another pause, then a sigh that carried 20 years of exasperation with her stubborn father. I don't like this. I know you don't. But sometimes the things we don't like are exactly the things we need to do. After they hung up, Colt stood in his driveway for a few more minutes, taking in the sight of the ranch that had been his home for most of his adult life. The main house sat solid and comfortable against the morning sky, surrounded by the oak trees he and Margaret had planted during their first year of marriage. The barn where he'd taught Sarah to ride was still standing strong, though it needed a new coat of paint. The pastures where his cattle had grazed stretched out toward the horizon, green and peaceful in the autumn light. It was a good place, a place that represented everything a man was supposed to want: security, success, legacy. But it had also become a prison of sorts, a gilded cage where he'd hidden from the harder truths about who he was and what he owed to the memory of a friend who died believing in him. He climbed into the truck and started the engine, listening to the familiar rumble of the V8. The GPS on his dashboard already had the coordinates programmed in not Tommy's original destination, but the small desert town of Barstow, California, where he planned to start his search. From there, he'd use Tommy's hand-drawn map to find whatever his friend had wanted him to find. As he drove down the long gravel driveway that led away from everything he'd built, Colt glanced in his rearview mirror and watched his old life disappear behind him. For the first time in years, instead of feeling sad about leaving something behind, he felt eager to see what lay ahead. The highway stretched out before him like a promise itself, long, uncertain, but leading somewhere that mattered. In his shirt pocket, Tommy's dog tags clinked softly against the photograph of their crew, a gentle reminder that some journeys were worth taking even when you couldn't see the destination. Behind him lay the ashes of an empire built on avoiding hard truths. Ahead lay the possibility of redemption, bought with everything he'd accumulated and paid for, with the courage to finally face what he'd been running from for 47 years. The road to California had never looked so much like a road home. The highway miles rolled past like pages in a book Colt had been meaning to read for decades. He'd driven cross-country before, but always with a specific business purpose, always with meetings scheduled and deadlines to meet. This felt different, more like traveling than simply going somewhere. The weight of urgency that had defined most of his adult life had lifted, replaced by something he couldn't quite name, but recognized as peace. By the time he crossed into New Mexico, The familiar Texas landscape had given way to something wilder and more open. The sky seemed bigger here, unmarked by the oil derricks and ranch houses that had defined his view for so long. He stopped for gas in a town so small it barely qualified for the name, just a cluster of buildings around a single intersection where the wind had free rein to rearrange the dust as it saw fit. The memories came in waves as he drove, not the painful flashbacks that had plagued him for years, but cleaner recollections that felt more like visiting with old friends. Tommy's laugh echoing in the cockpit during a supply run to Firebase Charlie. The way his friend used to fold his letters from home into precise squares before tucking them into his helmet. The morning Tommy had shown him a picture of Linda, his girl back home, and talked about the farm they were going to buy with the money he was saving from his military pay. "She's got it all picked out," Tommy had said, unfolding the letter that accompanied the photograph. 40 acres outside Tulsa, with a creek running through the middle and enough pasture for horses. Says she's been dreaming about it since she was little. White fence, red barn, maybe a vegetable garden where she can grow tomatoes big as softballs. Colt had teased him about being domesticated before his time, but the truth was he'd envied Tommy's certainty about what he wanted from life. While Colt was still figuring out who he was supposed to be, Tommy had it all planned out: the girl, the farm, the simple life that would wash away the complexity of war. None of it had happened, of course. Tommy never made it home to marry Linda or buy that farm or plant those tomatoes. But somewhere in the California desert, he'd left something that he'd considered important enough to extract a promise from his friend. After 47 years, Colt was finally going to find out what that something was. He reached Barstow just as the sun was setting, painting the desert mountains in shades of purple and gold that reminded him why people wrote songs about the American West. The town was bigger than he'd expected, but still had that end-of-the-world feeling that came with being surrounded by vast stretches of nothing. It was the kind of place where people came when they were either running from something or looking for something, sometimes both. The motel where he checked in was clean but basic, the sort of establishment that catered to travelers who needed a bed and a shower but weren't particular about thread count or complimentary breakfast. The desk clerk was a young woman with tired eyes and the kind of smile that suggested she'd seen enough of humanity's peculiarities to find them more interesting than shocking. "Passing through?" she asked as she handed him the room key. "In a manner of speaking. Most folks are. Not a lot of people come to Barstow as a destination." Colt signed the register with careful handwriting. "Maybe that's what makes it the right place to find what you're looking for." His room was on the second floor, with a view of the parking lot and the desert beyond. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone to call Sarah as promised, dreading the conversation but knowing it was necessary. "How was the drive?" she asked, without preamble. "Long but peaceful. I'm in Barstow, California, safe and sound in a motel that's seen better decades but still has running water and cable television." "Barstow," she repeated, and he could hear her typing on her computer. "It says here it's in the middle of the Mojave Desert. Daddy, what exactly are you looking for out there?" "I won't know until I find it." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I've got right now, sweetheart." There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came back softer, more worried than angry. "Richard thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. He's been researching grief counselors and talking about interventions. Richard means well, but he's never lost a friend in a war. Some things can't be fixed with therapy and good intentions, but they might be fixed by driving around the desert looking for something that might not even exist anymore." Colt pulled Tommy's hand-drawn map from his wallet and spread it on the motel room's small table. The napkin was more fragile than he'd remembered. The ink faded to the point where it was barely legible in the room's dim lighting. But the essential elements were still there, a rough sketch showing a canyon, some distinctive rock formations, and a small X marking the spot where Tommy had said he'd hidden something important. "It exists," Colt said, with more confidence than he felt. Tommy wasn't the kind of man to send someone on a wild goose chase. Tommy's been dead for 50 years, Daddy. Even if he did hide something out there, what are the chances it's still there? What are the chances you can even find it? I guess I'll find out tomorrow. After they hung up, Colt walked to the window and looked out at the desert landscape, now dark except for the distant lights of the highway. Somewhere out there, in all that emptiness, was the answer to a question that had been eating at him for nearly half a century. Tomorrow, he'd start looking for it, in earnest. He spread Tommy's map on the table under the room's brightest lamp and studied it carefully. His friend had been a good artist. The sketch showed surprising detail for something drawn on a napkin during a conversation between soldiers. The canyon was roughly triangular, with steep sides and what looked like a dry stream bed running through the bottom. The rock formations Tommy had drawn looked like fingers pointing toward the sky, and the X was marked near what appeared to be the canyon's eastern wall. It wasn't much to go on, but it was more than Colt had hoped for when he'd started this journey. Tomorrow, he'd drive into the desert with Tommy's map and his own determination, looking for a place that existed somewhere between memory and hope. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of morning. For the first time since Margaret's death, Colt fell asleep without the weight of unfinished business pressing down on his chest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 1 day's drive away from keeping a promise he should have kept 47 years ago. In his dreams, Tommy was waiting for him somewhere in the desert, grinning that infectious grin and pointing towards something just beyond the horizon. This time, Colt didn't wake up before he could see what his friend was trying to show him. The desert dawn came slowly, like a secret being revealed one shade at a time. Colt stood outside his motel room with coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a boot, watching the Mojave transform from black shadow to purple mystery to the kind of stark, honest landscape that didn't allow for illusions. By the time the sun cleared the eastern mountains, he was ready to find what Tommy had been waiting 47 years for him to discover. The local diner served breakfast to truckers, tourists, and the occasional treasure hunter drawn by stories of lost gold mines and abandoned military installations scattered throughout the desert. Colt sat at the counter, working his way through eggs and bacon while studying Tommy's hand-drawn map under the fluorescent lights. "You look like a man with a purpose," said the voice beside him. Colt looked up to find an older gentleman settling onto the adjacent stool, probably mid-70s. With skin weathered by decades of desert sun and eyes that held the particular clarity that came from seeing a lot of life without letting it make you bitter. He wore faded jeans, work boots that had earned their scuffs honestly, and a John Deere cap that had seen better years. "Pete Hawkins," the stranger said, extending a calloused hand. "Been living in these parts since before most folks knew where Barstow was. Colt Maddox. Just passing through, looking for something." Pete's eyes went to the napkin map spread on the counter. "That's some interesting artwork you got there. Looks military. I can always tell when something's been drawn by someone who learned to make sketches that might save lives someday. You serve. Army Corps of Engineers, 2 tours in Nam. You, helicopter pilot. Same war." Pete nodded with the understanding that passed between veterans who didn't need to explain what that meant. "Mind if I ask what you're looking for out there? Desert's full of interesting things, but most of 'em are better left alone." Colt hesitated, then decided that a man who'd survived 2 tours in Vietnam and 40 years in the desert had probably earned the right to an honest answer. "I'm looking for something a friend of mine hid out there in the 70s. Made me promise to find it if anything happened to him." And something happened to him. Helicopter went down in 76. Never found his body. Pete was quiet for a moment, studying the map with the intensity of someone who knew the terrain intimately. "This canyon here," he said, pointing to Tommy's triangle-shaped sketch, "looks familiar. If I'm reading this right, your friend was somewhere north of here, maybe 20 miles into the desert, where the BLM land butts up against the old gunnery range. You know the area?" "Know it like my own backyard." Been exploring these parts since I got out of the service. There's a canyon that matches this description. Steep sides, dry creek bed, rock formations that look like fingers pointing at the sky. Local folks call it Devil's Pocket on account of how the wind sounds when it blows through there. Colt felt his pulse quicken. How do I find it? Pete pulled a pen from his shirt pocket and drew on a napkin, his lines confident and precise. Take Highway 247 north about 15 miles, then turn east on this dirt road here. It's not marked, but you'll know it by the old windmill that's been broken since the Carter administration. Follow that road maybe 5 miles till you come to a fork, then bear left toward those hills that look like sleeping camels. Canyons hidden in there, tucked away where you can't see it until you're almost on top of it. Is it safe to drive out there alone? Safe as anywhere else in the desert, which is to say it'll kill you if you're stupid about it. Make sure you got plenty of water, spare tire, and someone who knows where you're going. Cell service is spotty at best once you get away from the highway. Colt folded both maps carefully and tucked them into his wallet. I appreciate the help. Don't mention it, but can I ask you something? Shoot. What makes a man spend 40-some years tracking down a promise? Must have been quite a friend. Colt was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain something he'd never been able to put into words, even for himself. Tommy was the kind of man who made you want to be better than you were. He had this way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. When he asked me to do something, it wasn't just a favor. It was him trusting me to be the man he believed I could be. Pete nodded slowly. And you've been carrying the weight of not being that man. Something like that. Well, Pete said, standing up and leaving money on the counter for his coffee. Seems to me like you're being that man now. Sometimes it just takes us a while to grow into who we're supposed to be. An hour later, Colt was driving north on Highway 247 inches his pickup, the desert stretching endlessly in all directions. The broken windmill Pete had described appeared exactly where he'd said it would, standing like a monument to optimism defeated by reality. The dirt road that branched off toward the east was barely more than tire tracks in the hardpan, but his truck handled it easily enough. The landscape changed as he drove deeper into the desert, less scrub brush, more rocks, with mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians of secrets too old to remember. He passed the fork in the road and bore left toward the hills that did indeed look like sleeping camels, their humped backs dark against the morning sky. It was almost noon when he saw it, a break in the rocky terrain that opened like a mouth in the earth, hidden behind a ridge that made it invisible until you were close enough to touch it. Devil's Pocket Canyon, just as Pete had described it. The sides were steep and striated with different colors of stone, and at the bottom Colt could see the dry stream bed that Tommy had sketched on his napkin. He parked the truck at the canyon's rim and walked to the edge, looking down into the shadowed depths where his friend's secret had been waiting for nearly half a century. The rock formations Tommy had drawn were there, fingers of stone pointing toward the sky like accusatory gestures frozen in time. Somewhere down in that canyon was the answer to a question that had haunted him for 47 years. All he had to do was climb down and find it. But first, he needed to call Sarah and let her know where he was, just in case the desert decided to collect another debt from the Maddox family. The descent into Devil's Pocket Canyon took Colt longer than he'd expected, partly because of the treacherous footing, and partly because with each step down the rocky slope, he was moving closer to a truth that had been waiting for him since 1976. By the time he reached the canyon floor, the sun was directly overhead, turning the narrow space into a natural oven that reminded him uncomfortably of some of the valleys he'd flown through in Vietnam. The helicopter wreckage sat against the canyon's eastern wall, exactly where Tommy's ex had marked it on his hand-drawn map. Even after 47 years, it was unmistakably a UH-1 Huey, the same type of aircraft they'd flown together in Southeast Asia. The desert had preserved it better than Colt had dared hope, While the paint had long since faded and the metal showed the rust and corrosion of decades, the basic structure remained intact. But this wasn't a combat loss. Even from a distance, Colt could tell that the helicopter had been deliberately landed rather than shot down. The skids were planted firmly on the canyon floor, the rotor blades were folded back as if the aircraft had been carefully parked, and there was no evidence of battle damage or catastrophic mechanical failure. Someone had flown this bird into the canyon intentionally, landed it safely, and then never taken off again. Colt approached the wreckage slowly, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the desert heat or the difficult climb. Each step brought him closer to answers he'd been seeking for nearly half a century, but also closer to truths that might be harder to bear than the uncertainty he'd lived with for so long. The cockpit was empty, though the pilot's seat still showed the impression where someone had sat for long periods. The instrument panel was dark and cracked, most of the gauges either broken or missing entirely. But when Colt climbed into the familiar space where he'd spent so many hours during the war, muscle memory took over and his hands found the controls automatically. It was then that he noticed the radio equipment. Unlike the rest of the aircraft systems, the radio had been partially disassembled and modified with components that looked newer than the helicopter itself. Someone had spent considerable time and effort rigging a communication system that could operate independently of the aircraft's main electrical system. Wires ran from the radio to what appeared to be a solar battery charging system mounted on the aircraft's roof. More importantly, a small green LED light was still blinking steadily on the radio's front panel. After 47 years, this piece of equipment was still functional. Colt stared at the blinking light for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing. Someone had not only hidden this helicopter in the canyon, but had also set up a long-term communication system designed to operate for decades without maintenance. The level of planning and foresight required for such a setup suggested this wasn't a hasty decision made by someone in trouble, but a carefully orchestrated operation with a specific purpose. He found the radio's power switch and turned it on, half expecting nothing to happen. Instead, the unit hummed to life with the electronic whine that seemed impossibly loud in the canyon's silence. The display showed numbers that meant nothing to him, but the fact that it was receiving power after all these years was remarkable enough. Then he noticed the cassette tape player built into the radio system. It was an old model, the kind that had been standard military issue in the mid-70s, but like the radio, it showed signs of modification and upgrade. A tape was already loaded in the player, and a handwritten label on the cassette read, "For Colt, play when you get here." Colt's hands shook as he pressed the play button. The speakers crackled with static for a moment, then Tommy Reeves's voice filled the canyon, sounding exactly as Colt remembered it from 4 decades earlier. "Well, partner, if you're hearing this, it means I was right about a couple of things. First, that you'd eventually keep your promise and come looking for me. Second, that I was probably right to be worried about what was going on back at base." Colt sank into the pilot's seat, overwhelmed by the sound of his friend's voice, speaking to him across nearly half a century. It was Tommy, unmistakably the same Oklahoma accent, the same easy confidence, the same hint of humor, even in serious moments. "I'm guessing you got a lot of questions right now, and I'm going to try to answer them best I can. But first thing you need to know is that I didn't die in any helicopter crash. I faked my death because I stumbled onto something that was going to get me killed for real if I stuck around." The tape hissed with static for a moment, then Tommy's voice continued. "You remember that supply run we made to Firebase Charlie 3 days before my accident? Well, it turns out we weren't just carrying ammunition and medical supplies. There were some wooden crates in that cargo that weren't on any manifest, and when I got curious and took a look inside, I found something that made my blood run cold." Colt closed his eyes, remembering that mission. It had seemed routine at the time, just another supply drop to a remote outpost. He'd been focused on flying, leaving the cargo manifest to Tommy and the crew chief. "Those crates were full of weapons, Colt, but not weapons for our guys. They were AK-47 seconds, Chinese-made ammunition, even some Soviet bloc explosives. Someone was using our supply runs to arm the other side. And when I started asking questions about it, I got some very unfriendly visits from people who suggested I might want to keep my curiosity to myself. The implications hit Colt like a physical blow. If Tommy was telling the truth, then someone in their own chain of command had been involved in selling weapons to the enemy, weapons that were likely used to kill American soldiers. I tried to go through proper channels, reported it to my CO, even tried to get word to intelligence, but everywhere I turned, doors got slammed in my face. Worse than that, I started getting threats. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, mysterious accidents with my equipment, that sort of thing. It became pretty clear that whoever was running this operation had enough juice to make problems disappear permanently. The tape continued with Tommy, explaining how he'd gathered evidence, documenting the weapons transfers, and identifying the personnel involved. But the more evidence he collected, the more dangerous his position became. So I did the only thing I could think of to do. I made myself disappear before they could make me disappear permanently. Took this bird on what was supposed to be a routine patrol, flew it out here to this canyon I'd scouted during a previous mission, and set it down where nobody would think to look for it. Colt opened his eyes and looked around the canyon with new understanding. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a refuge, a sanctuary where Tommy had hoped to wait out the danger long enough to find someone he could trust with the truth. The evidence is all here, Colt. Everything you need to prove what was happening, who was involved, and how they covered it up. I'm hiding it where you'll find it, along with this recording, because I know that someday you'll come looking for me, and I want you to have the whole story. The recording ended with Tommy's voice growing softer, more personal. I'm sorry I had to let everyone think I was dead, partner. I know that probably hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. But I couldn't see any other way to stay alive long enough to make sure the truth came out someday. Take care of yourself, and thanks for keeping your promise. The tape clicked off, leaving Colt alone in the canyon with the weight of revelations that changed everything he thought he knew about his friend's disappearance and his own service in Vietnam. Colt sat in the helicopter's cockpit for a long time after Tommy's recording ended, trying to process what he'd just heard. The desert silence pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through the canyon walls and the steady electronic hum of the radio equipment that had preserved his friend's voice for 47 years. Tommy hadn't died in a helicopter crash. He'd faked his own death to escape assassination by people within their own military command structure. The implications were staggering, but they also explained things that had never made sense about the incident. Why the search and rescue operation had been called off so quickly, why Tommy's body was never found, why the official report had been so vague about the details of the crash. There had been no crash. Just a carefully orchestrated disappearance by a man who discovered something that powerful people were willing to kill to keep secret. Following Tommy's instructions from the recording, Colt began searching the helicopter's cargo area for the hidden evidence his friend had mentioned. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for, a panel in the floor that had been carefully modified to create a concealed compartment. Inside was a military-issue waterproof case, sealed and locked, with Tommy's initials scratched into the metal surface. The case was heavier than Colt had expected, and when he opened it, he understood why. Inside were dozens of photographs, documents, audio cassettes, and what appeared to be official military correspondence, all carefully organized and labeled with Tommy's characteristic attention to detail. But more than that, there were items that turned Colt's blood cold. Photographs of wooden crates being loaded onto their helicopter, close-up shots of Soviet-made weapons and ammunition, and documents bearing the signatures of officers Colt recognized from their base command. Among the papers was a thick folder labeled Operation Steel Rain Classified. Inside were documents that made Colt's hands shake as he read them. What Tommy had stumbled onto wasn't just a rogue weapons-dealing operation. It was a systematic program designed to provide arms to both sides of various conflicts in Southeast Asia, artificially prolonging hostilities for reasons that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with profit. American servicemen had died from weapons sold to the enemy by their own command structure, and the profits had been used to fund black operations that Congress had never authorized. Tommy had documented it all: bank account numbers, shipping manifests, communication intercepts, even audio recordings of conversations between the conspirators. But the most damning evidence was a series of photographs showing Colonel Marcus Brennan, their base commander, personally overseeing the transfer of weapons to known enemy contacts. Brennan had been the father figure of their unit, the man who'd given inspiring speeches about duty and sacrifice and the importance of their mission. Seeing him in these photographs, casually shaking hands with people who were actively trying to kill American soldiers, was like discovering that your own father had been poisoning your dinner for months. As Colt worked his way through the evidence, a picture emerged that was even more disturbing than simple arms dealing. The conspiracy had tentacles that reached back to the Pentagon, involving officers who'd used their positions to enrich themselves, while American soldiers died with weapons that their own command structure had provided to the enemy. Tommy's documentation was thorough and meticulous, but it was also incomplete. Many of the documents were marked as Part 1 of 3, or C continuation files, suggesting that what Colt was looking at represented only a portion of the evidence Tommy had gathered. The rest, apparently, had been hidden somewhere else. At the bottom of the case, Colt found a sealed envelope marked "For Colt Read Last." Inside was a handwritten letter in Tommy's familiar scrawl, dated just a few days before his supposed death. "Partner," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means the situation has gotten worse than I hoped, and I had to go through with the disappearance plan. I want you to know that this wasn't an easy decision, leaving everyone to think I was dead, letting my family mourn me, letting you carry the guilt of losing a friend. But they were closing in, and I didn't have any other choice. The evidence in this case is just the tip of the iceberg. I've got more documentation hidden in 3 different locations, but this canyon cache should be enough to get the ball rolling if something happens to me before I can surface again. The problem is, I don't know how high up this conspiracy goes, so I can't trust official channels anymore. What I need you to do is take this evidence to someone outside the military chain of command, a reporter, a congressional investigator, someone who can't be bought or intimidated by the same people who tried to silence me. Don't go to the police or the FBI until you've got independent verification that the story is public, because these people have connections everywhere. I'm going to try to stay hidden until the heat dies down, but I'm not optimistic about my chances. If they find me, they'll make sure I disappear for real this time. That's why I need you to be my insurance policy, Colt. You're the only person I trust to see this through if I can't. There's something else you need to know, and it's going to be hard to hear. Colonel Brennan knows that I discovered the operation, and he's been asking questions about who else might have seen or suspected something. Your name has come up more than once in conversations I've overheard. I don't think he believes you know anything specific, but he's suspicious enough to keep an eye on you. Whatever you do, don't confront him directly or let on that you know anything about this. If he realizes that I've passed information to you, your life will be in danger too. Play dumb, finish your tour, and wait until you're safely back in civilian life before you act on any of this. I know this is a lot to ask, partner. I know it means carrying a secret that's going to eat at you for God knows how long. But American soldiers are dying because of these bastards, and somebody has to make sure the truth comes out eventually. Thanks for being the kind of friend a man can count on, even when the counting gets hard. Your wingman always, Tommy. Colt lowered the letter, his hands trembling with a combination of grief, rage, and something that might have been relief. For 47 years, He'd carried guilt about Tommy's death, wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some way he might have saved his friend. Now he knew the truth. Tommy hadn't died in combat or in an accident. He'd been murdered by people who were supposed to be on the same side, people who'd put profit above the lives of the soldiers under their command. But there was something else in the letter that made Colt's blood run cold. Tommy had been worried about Colt's safety, concerned that Colonel Brennan suspected he might know about the conspiracy. If that was true, then Colt's entire tour of duty after Tommy's disappearance had been spent under the watchful eyes of people who might have been planning to eliminate him as well. He thought back to those final months in Vietnam, remembering incidents that had seemed like routine military chaos at the time, but now took on a more sinister meaning. The reassignment that had moved him away from supply runs to routine transport missions. The early rotation back to the States that had surprised everyone, including Colt himself. The medical discharge that had ended his military career just as he was being considered for promotion to flight instructor. Had those been coincidences, or had someone been systematically removing him from positions where he might stumble onto the same evidence that had nearly gotten Tommy killed? The desert sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the canyon floor and reminding Colt that he'd been in this hidden place for most of the day. He needed to get back to his truck before full darkness made the climb out of the canyon dangerous, but first he had to decide what to do with the evidence Tommy had preserved for him. Taking it with him was the obvious choice, but Tommy's warning about the conspiracy's reach made him hesitant to simply load everything into his pickup and drive back to civilization. If these people had been willing to murder a soldier to protect their secret in 1976, what would they do to a civilian who threatened to expose them in 2023? As he carefully repacked the evidence into its waterproof case, Colt's phone buzzed with a text message. The fact that he was receiving any signal at all in this remote canyon surprised him, but what surprised him more was the message itself. "Mr. Maddox, we need to talk. Your recent travels have attracted some unwanted attention. Please call the number below immediately. Your safety may depend on it." The message was unsigned, but it included a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Colt stared at the screen, his mind racing. Fewer than a dozen people knew where he was, and most of them had no reason to be tracking his movements. But if Tommy's fears were justified, if the conspiracy he'd uncovered really did have connections that reached into the highest levels of government, then it was possible that someone had been monitoring Colt's activities from the moment he'd started this journey. The question was whether the person trying to contact him was someone who wanted to help, or someone who wanted to make sure that Tommy's evidence never saw the light of day. The climb out of Devil's Pocket Canyon in the fading desert light was treacherous enough without the weight of Tommy's evidence case and the knowledge that unknown forces might be tracking his every move. By the time Colt reached his truck, darkness had settled over the Mojave like a heavy blanket, and the isolation that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt ominous. He secured the evidence case in his truck's lockbox, then sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, staring at the mysterious text message on his phone. The smart thing would be to ignore it, drive straight back to Barstow, and figure out his next move from the relative safety of civilization. But 47 years of wondering had taught him that sometimes the smart thing wasn't the right thing. He dialed the number. It was answered on the first ring by a woman's voice, professional and carefully controlled. "Mr. Maddox, thank you for calling. My name is Agent Jennifer Walsh, and I'm with a federal task force that's been investigating the same conspiracy your friend uncovered in Vietnam. How do you know about Tommy? We've been aware of Operation Steel Rain for several years now, but we've never had access to the kind of evidence that could build a prosecutable case. When our surveillance systems flagged your GPS coordinates and cross-referenced them with missing person reports from the Vietnam era, we realized you might have found something significant." Colt felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "You've been watching me? Not you specifically, but the location you visited today. We've had monitoring equipment in that area for the past 3 years, ever since we learned that someone involved in the original conspiracy was making inquiries about the whereabouts of Thomas Reeves. Someone's been looking for Tommy? Someone's been looking for Tommy's evidence. The same evidence that's probably sitting in your truck right now. Agent Walsh's words confirmed Colt's worst fears. The conspiracy Tommy had uncovered wasn't just a historical footnote, it was an active threat, with people still alive and still committed to keeping their secrets buried. Mr. Maddox, I need to be very direct with you. Your life is in danger. The moment you accessed that evidence, you became a target for people who've spent nearly 50 years covering up their crimes. We can protect you, but only if you're willing to cooperate with our investigation. What kind of cooperation? We need you to bring the evidence to a secure location where our team can document it properly. More importantly, we need your help in identifying the personnel involved. You served with these people, you knew their faces, their voices, their habits. That kind of first-hand knowledge is invaluable in building a case. Colt was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. Trust a federal agent he'd never met, or strike out on his own with evidence that could get him killed. Neither choice felt particularly safe. How do I know you're really a federal agent? How do I know you're not part of the same conspiracy that killed Tommy? Because if I were part of the conspiracy, Mr. Maddox, you'd already be dead. The people we're after don't make phone calls, they make problems disappear permanently. It was a sobering point, but not entirely convincing. I need time to think about this. Time is the one thing you don't have. Our intelligence suggests that a cleanup team is already en route to your location. You need to get moving, now, before they arrive. As if summoned by her words, Colt saw headlights in the distance, moving across the desert toward his position, not the steady progression of traffic on a highway, but the purposeful movement of vehicles traveling off-road in his direction. "They're here," he said into the phone. "How many vehicles?" Colt counted the lights. 3, maybe 4, still a couple miles out, but definitely heading this way. Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Maddox. You need to get out of there immediately. Take Highway 247 south toward Barstow, but don't go back to your motel. They'll be watching it. Instead, take the exit for Lenwood Road and follow it west until you reach the truck stop at the interstate junction. There's a diner there called Eddie's Park in the back lot, and wait. We'll have people there to escort you to safety. And if this is a trap, then you'll find out soon enough. But right now, it's your best chance of staying alive long enough to see justice done for your friend." Colt started his truck and pulled away from the canyon as quickly as he dared on the rough desert road. In his rearview mirror, the pursuing headlights grew larger, confirming that whoever was out there was specifically targeting his location. As he drove through the darkness, his mind raced through the implications of what he'd discovered. Tommy's evidence didn't just prove that a few corrupt officers had been selling weapons to the enemy. It documented a conspiracy that had cost American lives and enriched people who'd sworn oaths to protect those same lives. If Agent Walsh was telling the truth about the investigation, then there was finally a chance to see justice done after nearly 5 decades. But if she was lying, if she was part of the same system that had silenced Tommy, then Colt was driving straight into a trap that would ensure the truth never came out. His phone rang again, but this time it was Sarah's number on the display. "Daddy, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all day. I'm driving back to Barstow. Had some trouble with cell coverage out in the desert. Well, I'm worried sick. Richard's been researching that area you're in, and he says it's dangerous. Rattlesnakes, flash floods, people getting lost and never found. Promise me you'll be more careful." "I promise, sweetheart." "Did you find what you were looking for?" Colt glanced in the rear-view mirror. The pursuing vehicles had reached the main road now, and they were definitely following him. "I found more than I expected." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means this whole thing is more complicated than I thought." "Sarah, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask questions about it. Daddy, you're scaring me. Call your lawyer, not mine, yours, and tell him that if anything happens to me in the next few days, he needs to contact the FBI immediately. Tell him there's evidence of a federal crime hidden in Safety Deposit Box 247 at First National Bank in Dallas. Can you remember that? Safety Deposit Box 247, First National Bank, FBI. But Daddy, promise me you'll remember that, Sarah. I promise. But what's this about? What kind of evidence? What federal crime? The kind that gets people killed for knowing about it. I love you, sweetheart. Take care of those boys and tell them their grandfather was proud of them. Daddy, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. You're going to come home and we're going to figure this out together. Colt wished he could share her optimism, but the headlights in his mirror were getting closer, and he could see the truck stop Agent Walsh had described in the distance. In a few minutes, he'd know whether he was driving toward salvation or straight into the arms of people who'd been waiting 47 years to tie up a loose end named Tommy Reeves. I hope you're right, sweetheart. But if I'm not, make sure the truth comes out. Make sure people know what really happened to Tommy, and make sure the men who killed him pay for what they did. He ended the call and pulled into the truck stop parking lot, following Agent Walsh's instructions to park behind the diner. The lot was mostly empty at this hour, with just a few big rigs and a handful of cars belonging to late-night travelers seeking coffee and conversation. Eddie's diner looked exactly like what it was, a desert oasis that had been serving truckers and tourists for decades, with neon signs that had seen better years and windows that glowed warmly against the darkness. Under different circumstances, it would have seemed like a welcoming refuge from the harsh emptiness of the Mojave. Tonight, it felt like a place where secrets came to die. Colt sat in his truck, Tommy's evidence case locked securely beside him, watching the entrance to the parking lot for either federal agents or the people who'd been following him across the desert. In his shirt pocket, Tommy's dog tags pressed against his chest like a reminder of promises kept and prices paid. Somewhere inside the diner, people were drinking coffee and sharing stories about the road, unaware that history might be about to turn on the fulcrum of decisions made in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere. In a few minutes, Colt would find out whether Tommy's sacrifice had been worth it, whether justice was possible after 47 years, or whether some secrets were too dangerous to survive the telling. A black sedan pulled into the parking lot, followed by a second vehicle that looked like it had government plates. Agent Walsh, if that was really her name, was about to become either Colt's salvation or his final mistake. He picked up Tommy's unfinished letter from the passenger seat and read the last line again. "Thanks for being the kind of friend a man can count on, even when the counting gets hard." The counting, Colt reflected as he stepped out of his truck with the evidence case in hand, was about to get very hard indeed. The woman who emerged from the black sedan looked exactly like what Colt expected a federal agent to look like, mid-40s, professionally dressed despite the late hour, moving with the kind of controlled alertness that came from years of dealing with dangerous situations. She approached his truck alone, keeping her hands visible and her movements deliberately non-threatening. "Mr. Maddox, Agent Jennifer Walsh, Federal Bureau of Investigation." She held up credentials that looked authentic in the diner's neon glow, though Colt had no way to verify them in a truck stop parking lot in the middle of the night. "You'll forgive me if I'm a little skeptical about credentials," Colt said, though he kept his voice conversational rather than confrontational. "Smart man. Your friend Tommy would have appreciated that kind of caution." Agent Walsh gestured toward the diner. "There's someone inside who can vouch for my identity, someone who knew Thomas Reeves personally and has been working this case longer than I've been alive." She led him toward the diner's entrance, where a man in his 70s sat alone in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper that was at least 2 days old. He looked up as they approached, and Colt felt a shock of recognition that nearly knocked him off his feet. "Hello, Colt," said Colonel Marcus Brennan. It's been a long time. Colt's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket, where he'd placed the wire recording device he'd found among Tommy's equipment, a small digital recorder that he'd activated before leaving his truck, just in case this meeting went sideways. "Surprised to see me?" Brennan asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose you thought I'd be dead by now. Hell, I thought I'd be dead by now, but some of us are harder to kill than others." "You son of a bitch," Colt said quietly. "Tommy trusted you. We all trusted you. And I've spent 47 years living with that betrayal," Brennan replied, gesturing for Colt to sit across from him in the booth. "But before you decide whether to try to shoot me or just walk away, you might want to hear the whole story." Agent Walsh slid into the booth beside Brennan, her position making it clear that she was protecting him rather than arresting him. "Colonel Brennan has been working with federal investigators for the past 15 years, helping us build a case against the people who were really running Operation Steel Rain. I was the fall guy," Brennan explained, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent carrying guilt. "The Pentagon needed someone to blame when the operation started attracting attention from congressional investigators, so they hung it all on me. Made it look like I was running a rogue weapons-dealing scheme for personal profit." Colt stared at the man who'd been his commanding officer, trying to reconcile the father figure he remembered with the criminal Tommy had documented in his evidence. "Tommy had photographs of you personally overseeing weapons transfers. Tommy had photographs of me trying to gather evidence about who was really running the operation. Those wooden crates he documented, I was investigating them too, trying to figure out who was using our supply runs to move unauthorized material." "That's not what his evidence suggests." Brennan leaned forward, his eyes intense with the urgency of a man who'd spent decades waiting for this conversation. "Colt, think about it. If I was really running a weapons-dealing operation, would I have been stupid enough to get photographed doing it? Would I have let a co-pilot get close enough to document everything?" Agent Walsh opened a folder on the table, revealing documents that looked official and recent. What Thomas Reeves discovered was a Department of Defense black operation run by a group of Pentagon officials who were using weapons sales to fund activities that Congress had specifically prohibited. Colonel Brennan was investigating the same operation from within the command structure. "Then why didn't you two work together?" Colt asked. Brennan's face darkened with old pain. "Because I didn't know Tommy had discovered anything until it was too late. By the time I realized what he'd stumbled onto, the real conspirators had already decided he was too dangerous to let live. I tried to protect him by having him reassigned to safer duties, but he disappeared before I could explain what was really happening." "You faked his death." "I helped him fake his death," Brennan corrected. "When I realized that assassination teams were looking for him, I provided him with the resources he needed to disappear. That helicopter, the radio equipment, the supplies he used to set up his hideout in the canyon, all of it came from me. And you let everyone think he was dead. It was the only way to keep him alive long enough for the truth to come out. But the investigation took longer than any of us expected, and Tommy," Brennan's voice broke slightly, "Tommy didn't make it long enough to see justice done." Agent Walsh opened another folder, this one containing photographs that made Colt's blood run cold. They showed what was clearly human remains in military clothing, partially preserved by the dry desert climate. "We found Thomas Reeves's body 3 months ago," she said quietly, "hidden in a cave about 5 miles from where you found the helicopter. He'd been shot twice in the back of the head, execution style." The diner seemed to spin around Colt as the implications sank in. Tommy hadn't survived his disappearance after all. Sometime after recording that message and hiding the evidence, the people he'd been running from had found him and killed him just as he'd feared they would. "The recording you found was made before his death," Brennan explained. "He'd set up that cache as insurance, hoping that if something happened to him, someone would eventually find the evidence and continue his work. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you. Tommy told me about the promise he'd made you extract, about the coordinates he'd given you. He was counting on your sense of loyalty to bring you to that canyon eventually. Agent Walsh leaned forward, her expression urgent. Mr. Maddox, we're very close to closing this case, but we need the evidence Tommy preserved to make it stick. The people responsible are still alive, still in positions of power, still dangerous. But with Tommy's documentation and your testimony about what you knew back then, we can finally bring them to justice. Colt looked around the diner at the late-night truckers and travelers who had no idea that history was being made over coffee and pie in a corner booth. After 47 years of carrying guilt about a promise unkept, he finally understood what Tommy had really been asking of him. Not just to find the evidence, but to see justice done for a friend who died trying to protect the very soldiers he'd served alongside. The evidence transfer took place at a federal facility outside Las Vegas, in a secure conference room that felt like something out of a spy movie. Colt sat at a table surrounded by FBI agents, Justice Department prosecutors, and Pentagon investigators, watching as Tommy's carefully preserved documentation was catalogued and analyzed by people who understood its full implications. Agent Walsh had been right about the significance of what Tommy had discovered. The Operation Steel Rain conspiracy involved not just weapons trafficking, but a systematic program of war profiteering that had cost hundreds of American lives and generated millions in illegal profits. The evidence Tommy had died protecting was the missing piece that connected decades of suspicious activities to specific individuals who were still alive and, in some cases, still in positions of authority. "This is extraordinary work," said Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, looking up from a stack of documents that chronicled bank transfers and arms shipments spanning nearly 2 decades. "Your friend was essentially conducting a one-man investigation that rivals anything our organized crime task forces have produced." Colonel Brennan, now officially retired but serving as a consultant to the investigation, nodded with something that looked like pride mixed with profound sadness. Tommy was always thorough. Even as a young co-pilot, he had this need to understand how everything fit together, to see the big picture instead of just focusing on his immediate responsibilities. "It's going to be enough to prosecute?" Colt asked. "More than enough," Agent Walsh replied. "We've already secured indictments against 6 individuals, including 2 former Pentagon officials who are still alive. The evidence Tommy preserved provides direct documentation of conspiracy, war profiteering, and in at least 3 cases, accessory to murder." "Murder?" Chen opened another file, this one containing photographs and reports that painted a picture of systematic elimination of potential witnesses. Thomas Reeves wasn't the only person killed to protect this conspiracy. "We've identified at least 4 other servicemen who died under suspicious circumstances after discovering aspects of the operation." The weight of that revelation settled on Colt like a physical burden. Tommy hadn't just been one man who'd stumbled onto corruption. He'd been part of a pattern of witnesses who'd been systematically silenced to protect a criminal enterprise that had operated for decades within the U.S. military structure. "There's something else," Agent Walsh said, producing a document that bore official seals and signatures. "The investigation has been expanded to include a review of all personnel actions taken during the relevant time period. We found some interesting entries in your own service record, Mr. Maddox." She handed him a file that contained copies of orders and evaluations he'd never seen before. Reading them now, with the knowledge of what Tommy had discovered, painted his final months in Vietnam in an entirely different light. Your reassignment away from supply duties, your early rotation home, your medical discharge, none of it was routine, Agent Walsh explained. Someone was systematically removing you from situations where you might discover what Tommy had found. In effect, they were protecting you because they believed you were innocent but potentially dangerous. They were planning to kill me too? The documents suggest they were debating it. Your clean record and lack of curiosity about anything beyond your immediate flight duties worked in your favor. They decided you were safer to leave alone than to eliminate. Colonel Brennan leaned forward, his expression grave. "That was my doing, partly. I convinced them that you were just a pilot who followed orders and didn't ask questions about cargo manifests or supply destinations. I may have saved your life by arguing that you were too naive to be a threat." It was a sobering thought that his life had been spared because people had judged him too unobservant to be dangerous. But it also meant that his 47 years of guilt about not helping Tommy had been misplaced. He'd never had the chance to help because people much more powerful than him had been manipulating events from the beginning. "What happens now?" Colt asked. "Now we finish what Thomas Reeves started," Chen replied. "The grand jury has already returned indictments, and arrests will begin within the week. Some of these people are quite elderly, but they're going to face trial for conspiracy, war profiteering, and accessory to murder." Agent Walsh pulled out a final document, an official letter bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. "There's also this. The Pentagon has agreed to posthumously award Thomas Reeves the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service in exposing corruption within the military command structure. It's the least we can do for a man who gave his life trying to protect his fellow soldiers." Colt stared at the document, feeling something in his chest that might have been the weight of 47 years finally lifting. Tommy would receive the recognition he deserved, his name would be cleared, and his sacrifice would be remembered as an act of heroism rather than a tragic accident. "I'd like to be there when you present it to his family," Colt said. "We were hoping you'd say that," Agent Walsh replied, with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Tommy's sister, Linda, is still alive. She's 83 now, living in Tulsa. She never stopped believing that her brother was a hero, even when the official records suggested otherwise." "Linda?" Colt looked up sharply. "The girl from the photograph?" Colonel Brennan nodded. "She never married. Spent her whole life waiting for Tommy to come home, then spent the next 47 years trying to prove he was a better man than the army said he was. She's going to be very happy to meet the friend who finally kept his promise." For the first time since this journey began, Colt felt something that might have been peace settling in his chest. Tommy's promise had been kept, justice would be served, and a hero's name would finally be cleared after nearly half a century of shadows. The road to redemption had been longer and more complicated than he'd expected, but it had led exactly where it was supposed to go. 6 months later, Colt stood in a cemetery outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, watching as military honor guards folded an American flag with the precision that only comes from performing the same ceremony hundreds of times for heroes who never made it home. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with words that finally told the truth. "Thomas J. Reeves, Congressional Medal of Honor, Hero of the Vietnam War, Defender of Truth." Linda Reeves Patterson stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm for support. At 83, she was smaller and more fragile than the young woman in Tommy's photograph, but her eyes held the same gentle strength that had made her brother believe in the goodness of people even in the worst circumstances. "He would have liked you," she said quietly as the honor guard presented her with the folded flag. "Tommy always said the measure of a man wasn't how quickly he got where he was going, but whether he got there at all when it mattered." The ceremony was small, just family, a few local veterans, and the federal agents who'd worked the case. But it felt complete in a way that the grand prosecutions and newspaper headlines hadn't. This was personal, intimate, the kind of goodbye that should have happened 47 years ago, but was finally taking place where it belonged. Sarah stood on Colt's other side, her own eyes, wet with tears, for an uncle she'd never met, but had come to understand through her father's stories. She'd driven down from Dallas with her boys, both of whom had listened with rapt attention as Colt explained how sometimes doing the right thing required more courage than anyone should have to possess. "Grandpa," said Jake, the older boy, "why did it take so long for people to find out the truth?" It was a good question, one that Colt had wrestled with throughout the investigation and trials that had dominated the past 6 months. 6 men had been convicted of conspiracy and war profiteering, including 2 former Pentagon officials who'd spent decades in positions of authority they'd never deserved. Justice had been served, but it had come too late for Tommy and too late for the other soldiers who'd died because of the weapons their own command structure had provided to the enemy. "Sometimes the truth is dangerous to powerful people," Colt replied, "and it takes time for someone brave enough to stand up to them. Your great-uncle Tommy was that brave, but he paid the price for it." "Are you brave like that too?" Colt glanced at Linda, who smiled with the kind of understanding that came from having waited most of her life for this conversation. "I'm trying to be. It just took me longer to figure out how." After the ceremony, they gathered at Linda's house for a meal that felt like the family reunion Tommy had never lived to attend. The house was small but comfortable, filled with photographs and mementos that told the story of a life spent honoring the memory of a brother who died too young. Linda had never married, had never had children of her own, but she'd spent 47 years keeping Tommy's memory alive through her work with veterans organizations and her quiet refusal to accept the official story about his death. "I knew he wasn't the kind of man to die in some meaningless accident," she said as they sat around her kitchen table, sharing stories and memories. "Tommy was too careful, too smart, too aware of what was happening around him. When they told me his helicopter had crashed, I knew something was wrong. I just never knew what." "He was protecting you," Colt said. "All of us. He knew that if he'd involved anyone else in what he'd discovered, their lives would have been in danger too." Linda reached across the table and took his hand. "But he trusted you to finish what he'd started, even when it took you 47 years to get around to it." Colt smiled at that, thinking about the long road that had brought him to this kitchen table in Oklahoma. He'd lost an empire, but gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he was finally the man Tommy had believed he could be. The guilt that had weighed on him for nearly half a century was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose that money had never been able to provide. The foundation he'd established with the proceeds from his liquidated empire was already making a difference in the lives of veterans and their families. Named the Thomas J. Reeves Foundation for Military Truth and Justice, it provided legal assistance to servicemen and women who discovered wrongdoing within their chain of command, ensuring that future whistleblowers wouldn't face the isolation and danger that Tommy had confronted alone. "What will you do now?" Linda asked, as the afternoon wound down and it came time for goodbyes. "Keep the promise going," Colt replied. "Make sure that what happened to Tommy doesn't happen to other soldiers who find the courage to speak truth to power." Sarah hugged him tightly as they prepared to leave. "I'm proud of you, Daddy. Mama would be proud too." "Think so?" "I know so. She always said that a man's true wealth wasn't measured by what he accumulated, but by what he did with it when it mattered most." As they drove back toward Dallas in the late afternoon light, Colt reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from the empty halls of a mansion in Texas to a simple kitchen table in Oklahoma. He'd started this quest thinking it was about keeping a promise to a dead friend, but it had turned out to be about much more than that. It was about integrity, about the courage to face hard truths, even when they cost everything, about the difference between success and significance. Tommy's dog tags rode in his shirt pocket one last time, but tomorrow he would place them in the Foundation's offices as a reminder of the price that real heroes pay and the debts that true friends never stop working to repay. The promise had been kept, justice had been served, and somewhere in the endless sky above the American West, a helicopter pilot's ghost could finally rest easy, knowing that his sacrifice had meant something after all. Some promises, Colt had learned, are worth a lifetime of waiting to keep, and some friends are worth giving up everything to honor.